The urinary system. The function of the urinary system is to filter out wastes from your blood, plus it also helps with water balance, the amount of water that's in your tissues, and also helps with pH balance, whether you're alkaline or acidic. So we're going to look at the anatomy of the kidneys, and then we're going to look at the anatomy of the urinary system in the male and in the female systems. And this will also, some of the same parts that we use in the urinary system are the same parts we're going to use in the reproductive system. So a little of this is going to be redundant. This is showing you the kidney. We're going to see some structures that are on the outside, and then we're going to cut inside and look at some of the structures on the inside. We'll start on the right-hand side in the upper line and work our way clockwise, and then we'll start on the upper left-hand side and work our way counterclockwise. And to save time as I label these structures, I'm just going to use the first letter of the structure or the first few letters. So in the upper right-hand side, this is pointing to the outside of the kidney. This is known as the renal capsule. This is going to be a dense, irregular connective tissue, and it surrounds the entire kidney. It separates the inside of the kidney from the outside of the kidney, kind of like your skin. It separates your internal environment from your external environment. The renal capsule is pretty important because it prevents the spread of infection. Since all of your blood is going through the kidneys, it could carry some infectious materials with it. And then if the kidney gets infected, it'll prevent that infection from spreading to the tissues that surround it, or vice versa. If the tissues surrounding the kidney are infected, it prevents the infection from spreading inside of the kidney. All right, the next line is pointing to a funnel. And a funnel inside of the kidney is called a calyx. And there's two types of calyx or calyces. There's a minor calyx and a major calyx. The major calyx leads to the renal pelvis, and this next line is pointing to the major calyx. All right, the next line is pointing to the smaller funnel, which is located real close to the renal papilla. This is known as the minor calyx. C-A-L-Y-X. Trying to write with my finger, it's not working too well. Anyway, so the minor calyx, that was the next line. And then the next line is pointing to a column of tissue known as the renal column. The kidney, whenever you cut it in half, you can separate the outer part into the renal cortex and the middle part being the renal medulla. So the renal cortex is just the outer part. The renal medulla is the inner part. The renal medulla are these pyramid-shaped structures that I'm kind of drawing in right here. That is the renal pyramid. That is also the renal medulla. But every so often the renal cortex dips in between the renal pyramids, and that is the renal column. All right, the next line, it is pointing to the renal cortex, which is the outer part of the kidney. The functional unit of the kidney is called the nephron. The nephrons, if they're completely located in the cortex, they're called cortical nephrons. If the nephron dips down into the renal pyramid, then they're called juxtamedullary nephrons. So the cortical nephrons are located in the cortex. Now let's do the upper left. The upper left line is pointing to the renal pyramid. Pyramid has a base and an apex to it. The base is closest to the renal cortex. The apex of the pyramid is the renal papilla, and it leads to the minor calyx. Now let's look at these blood vessels. The red blood vessel associated with the kidney is the renal artery. The next blood vessel is the vein where the blood leaves the kidney. That is the renal vein. And then the next section is pointing to part of the ureter. The ureter is the tube that goes from the kidney all the way down to the bladder. This first part of the ureter is called the renal pelvis. The major calyces that we labeled earlier that I'm circling right now, the major calyces, they lead and join to form the renal pelvis. And then the last thing that is labeled on here is the ureter. The ureter is a muscular tube that goes from the kidney all the way down to the bladder. All right, so renal cortex, this tissue on the outside, that's the renal cortex. The major calyx is right here. The minor calyx is right above it, right here. And then the renal column is right here. The renal cortex is going to be everything that I'm highlighting right now with this laser pointer. That is the cortex. Oh, I skipped a line. That next line that's on the bottom, That is the renal papilla. I'm just going to put pap, but it's the renal papilla. The renal papilla leads to the minor calyx, which will be right here. The minor calyces lead to the major calyx, and then the major calyces all together form the renal pelvis. All right, then here we have the renal pyramid right here. This is the apex of the renal pyramid. This is also known as the renal papilla, and here's the base. This is the renal artery. This line is the renal vein, and then this line is the renal pelvis, and then this line is the ureter. Some people pronounce it ureter, but it's ureter. This is also a model of the kidney, and now we can see the adrenal gland right above it. So we're going to start with this line right here. We're going to label it and then work our way counterclockwise all the way around the kidney. All right, so the first thing that's on the upper left, that is the adrenal gland. We looked at this when we looked at the endocrine system. The adrenal gland is separated to an adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex produces hormones like aldosterone and cortisol. The adrenal medulla produces hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine. This next line is pointing to the renal capsule. We looked at that in the previous slide. The next line is pointing to the renal column. We saw that in the previous slide. The next line is pointing to the outer part of the kidney, which is the cortex. The next line is pointing to the renal pelvis. The next line is pointing to the renal pyramid. The next line is pointing to a minor calyx. The next line is pointing to the major calyx. The next line is pointing to the renal papilla. Again, I'm going to put pap, but that is the renal papilla. The next line is pointing to the ureter. And then the next line is pointing to the renal vein. And then the next line is pointing to the renal artery. All right, so the adrenal gland is right here. Next, we're pointing to the renal capsule, which is the outer part of the kidney right here. And here's the renal column. The renal column is where the renal cortex dips down in between the renal pyramids. This next line is the cortex right here. This line is pointing to the renal pelvis right here. This line is pointing to this structure, which is the renal pyramid. This line is pointing to the minor calyx. This line is pointing to the major calyx. This line is pointing to this apex of the renal pyramid, known as the renal papilla. This line is pointing to the ureter. This line is pointing to the renal vein. And then this line is pointing to the renal artery. Okay, in this picture, we'll start with the right-hand side. We'll start with this line right here, which is pointing to this structure. And then we'll go to this line, and then this one, that one, that one, and that one. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is the upper right line, and that is pointing to the renal pelvis. Again, these are the same structures we looked at in the last two slides. So this is a different model. It looks a little different, so that's why it's on this PowerPoint. The next line is pointing to the ureter. That's the tube that goes to the bladder. The next line is pointing to the renal pyramids, or it could say renal medulla, because the renal pyramids are the renal medulla. So there's two answer choices possible here, either renal pyramid or renal medulla. The next line is pointing to the minor calyx. The next line is pointing to the major calyx. And then this last line is pointing to the renal cortex. All right, so again, the renal pelvis is right here. The ureter is right here. Renal pyramids are right here or right here. They're all the way around, as a matter of fact. This region of the kidney is also known as the renal medulla, so it could say renal medulla or pyramid. This structure is the minor calyx, which leads to this structure, which is the major calyx. And then this, all of this right here, this is all cortex of the kidney. So the functional unit of the kidney is called the nephron. The two main parts of the nephron are called the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. So this model is showing the renal corpuscle. We're going to start with these structures up here. I'm going to actually start with these arteries right here and here. I should say arterioles right here and right here. And then we'll go down to this line and then this line. So we're going to zigzag back and forth and then end up in that line right there. All right, so the blood vessels at the top. The one on the left-hand side, that's called the afferent arteriole. So afferent means it's leading to something. The afferent arteriole is bringing blood into the renal corpuscle in this direction right there. It goes into the glomerulus, which is the ball of capillaries inside of the renal corpuscle. The other blood vessel on the right-hand side, the upper, is called the efferent arteriole. So blood, when it returns from the glomerulus, it goes out in this direction. So you'll notice that the afferent arteriole is thicker than the efferent arteriole, and that is because there's more blood going into the glomerulus than is coming out. That is because some of the plasma is going to seep out from the capillaries and be caught. That plasma is going to be the filtrate. Now some of that filtrate will be recaptured. It's going to pull back some water or reabsorb some water from it, and some ions, especially reabsorb any type of glucose that went through. And then whatever is left over will be eliminated as urine. All right, so this next line, that is pointing to the ball of capillaries inside of the renal corpuscle, and that's called the glomerulus. All right, the next line is pointing to the glomerular capsule. So I'm going to put glom cap, because that is the glomerular capsule, but there's another name for it. It's also known as Bowman's capsule. So Bowman's capsule, glomerular capsule, they are the same thing. Now the Bowman's capsule, the glomerular capsule, it forms the next line, which is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal, because it's closest to the renal corpuscle. Convoluted, because if we were able to see the whole thing, it's not a straight tube. It's convoluted. It has a lot of twists and turns in it. All right, so the afferent arteriole is right here, bringing blood into the renal corpuscle and to the glomerulus, which is going to be right here. This is the glomerulus. And the blood exits through the efferent arteriole right here. This capsule that surrounds the glomerulus, this is called the glomerular capsule, also known as the Bowman's capsule. And then this structure right here is called the proximal convoluted tubule. And now we're back to the kidney. Now this is going to seem really redundant, but again, it's a different picture. This is actually a picture of the model that we have in the lab, if we were still in the lab to be able to look at it. So we're going to start with this structure up here in the upper left-hand side, and then work our way around counterclockwise, and then come over here to the right-hand side and go clockwise in those structures right there. So the upper left side, that is pointing to the arcuate vessels. I'm going to put ARC. The blood vessels, the arcuate blood vessels, go along the base of the pyramid. So I just drew a black line over them. Those are the arcuate vessels. The red vessels called the arcuate artery. The blue vessels, the arcuate vein. All right, the next line is pointing to the interlobar vessel. So the interlobar artery, interlobar vein. I'm going to draw a line and I'm going to erase it, but there's going to be a line here and a line here. Where I just drew those lines, it shows you where there's a renal pyramid and the cortex above it. That's called a lobe of the kidney, so that's one lobe. So that means these blood vessels that are in between the lobes, those are the interlobar arteries. All right, I'm going to erase these. All right, continuing on below the interlobar vessels, we have a calyx. We have the major calyx. All right, the next line is pointing to the renal papilla. The next line is pointing to the renal pelvis. And then the last line on the left-hand side is pointing to the ureter. That's the tube that goes all the way down the bladder. Now let's go along the right side. This first line that's branched off is pointing to the pyramids. It's pointing to two different pyramids. And then the next line is pointing to the renal cortex. And then the last line is pointing to the minor calyx. All right, so major calyx was over here, that's the line, and then the minor calyx is right here. All right, so arcuate vessels are these vessels that go along the base of the pyramid. Interlobar vessels are these vessels in between the lobes of the kidney. Major calyx is right here. Renal papilla is right there. Renal pelvis is right here. And then ureter right here. The pyramids, they're pointing to them right here and right here. But each one of these that I'm using the light for right now, those are all renal pyramids all the way around. The cortex is going to be this tissue right here. And then this funnel that's closest to the renal papilla, this is the minor calyx. Now this model, I admit, looks weird because it doesn't look like any type of organ that we have. But it is showing you the functional units of the kidney, which is going to be the nephron. So the parts of the nephron include the renal corpuscle, and then the tube that leads away from it, the renal tubule. So we're going to start at the upper left-hand side up here. We're going to label that line and then go down to those 4. And then on the right-hand side, do these 4. All right, so first in the upper left, that is pointing to the cortical nephron. If the nephron is completely in the cortex, then it's called a cortical nephron. This next line is pointing to a structure called the distal convoluted tubule. Now, there are 2 parts of the nephron. The renal corpuscle, we've already looked at when we looked at the model of the renal corpuscle. Then we have the renal tubule. The renal tubule starts with the proximal convoluted tubule, and then makes a loop. There's a descending limb of the nephron loop, and then there's an ascending limb of the nephron loop, and then there's a distal convoluted tubule. And right here is the distal convoluted tubule. It leads to a structure called the collecting duct. All right, the next line is pointing to the juxtamedullary nephrons. So the cortical nephrons are in the cortex of the kidney. Juxtamedullary nephrons are located where they dip down into the medulla or the pyramid. All right, the next line is pointing to the ascending limb of the nephron loop. Let's go to the right-hand side. The upper line is pointing to the proximal convoluted tubule. All right, the next line is pointing to the renal corpuscle. All right, the next line is pointing to the collecting duct. And then the next line is pointing to the descending limb. I'm going to trace out the flow of the filtrate. We're going to start at the renal corpuscle. Whenever the filtrate leaves the renal corpuscle, it goes into the proximal convoluted tubule, and then the proximal convoluted tubule becomes the descending limb of the nephron loop, and then it circles around and becomes the ascending limb of the nephron loop, and then the filtrate goes into the collecting duct. Multiple distal convoluted tubules lead to the same collecting duct, and then the collecting duct is going to exit through the renal papilla, and then the filtrate goes into the minor calyx. Once the filtrate goes into the minor calyx, nothing else can be reclaimed from it. It's going to go straight to the bladder, and then it'll be eliminated as urine. This picture is showing a model of the renal lobe. The renal cortex is all of this right here. This is all renal cortex, and then down here, this is the renal pyramid, so this is the renal medulla. Now these structures get a little complicated. We're going to start up here on this one and then work our way around the clock, going clockwise around this way, labeling all of these structures all the way around. All right, so the one at the very top, those are the renal corpuscles. So I'm just going to put core. Those are the renal corpuscles. The ones that are pointing to, those are whole. The ones below it, where we can see the glomerulus, they've been cut in half. The next line is showing the afferent arterioles. They're bringing blood into the renal corpuscle. So those are the afferent arterioles. The next line is pointing to the proximal convoluted tubule. This is the renal tubule that's attached to Bowman's capsule, or attached to the renal corpuscle. The next line is pointing to the efferent arterioles. This is the blood that's leaving the glomerulus and going to the peritubular capillaries. So those are the efferent arterioles. The next line is pointing to the distal convoluted tubule. This is a tubule that's furthest away from renal corpuscle, and this is one that attaches to the collecting duct. The next line is pointing to the ascending limb of the nephron loop. All right, continuing around. This line that's on the bottom, on the left-hand side, that is the collecting duct. Collecting duct is going to lead to the minor calyx. Multiple distal convoluted tubules lead to the same collecting duct. The next line is pointing to the interlobar arteries. Or an interlobar vessel, if you can see the vein there as well. These are the vessels that are between the lobes of the kidney. The next line is pointing to a descending limb of the nephron loop. The next line is pointing to the arcuate vessels. And then the next line is pointing to an artery that has two different names. There's cortical radiate, cortical, because it's in the cortex, radiate, R-A-D-I-A-T. It's also known as the interlobular artery. But I'm not going to write that down. We're just going to worry about cortical radiate vessels. All right, so we have the renal corpuscle right here and right here. Afferent arteriole right here, right there. Proximal convoluted tubule right here. Distal convoluted tubule is going to be right here. Ascending limb is going to be right here. The collecting duct is right here. The interlobar vessels right here. The descending limb is right here. The arcuate vessels right here. And then the cortical radiate vessels right here. This is another model of the renal corpuscle. We saw one earlier as a little darker in color. This one's a little brighter, and this is actually just like the one that we have in the lab, if we were able to see that. So we're going to start right here at the upper right-hand corner, and again work our way around the clock, labeling these structures. So the first one on the right-hand side, the upper side, that is a part of the distal convoluted tubule. Now the tubule, the proximal convoluted tubule is right down here. I'm just going to go ahead and put that in. The proximal convoluted tubule then leads to the descending limb and the nephron loop, which leads to the ascending limb, and then leads to the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule passes real close to the afferent and efferent arteriole, and there's an area right here of cells that when stimulated, they produce the hormone known as renin. All right, let's continue on labeling. The next line underneath the distal convoluted tubule is the efferent arteriole. The next line is pointing to the glomerulus. It could say glomerulus or it could say glomerular capillaries. The next line is pointing to the glomerular capsule, also known as Bowman's capsule. The next one we've already labeled is the proximal convoluted tubule. Now if we continue around on the left-hand side, this next line is pointing to those yellow cells. Those cells cover the glomerulus and they're called podocytes. The podocytes will cover the glomerulus and they control how much filtrate leaves the system. Plus it also helps keep the proteins inside of the circulatory system. We don't want to lose proteins from the circulatory system. And then the last line on the left-hand side, is the afferent arteriole. All right, so the afferent arteriole is right here. Efferent arteriole is right here. This part of the renal tubule that passes real close to the efferent arteriole is the distal convoluted tubule. These cells are the podocytes. Now, they do cover all of the glomerulus, but they've removed them from the right-hand side so we can see the glomerulus underneath it. But these are the podocytes. And then this line is pointing to the glomerulus. This is pointing to the glomerular capsule. And then this is pointing to this is the proximal convoluted tubule. This is showing the kidneys inside of the torso. So this line on the left-hand side is pointing to the kidney. Hopefully you already knew that. And then this line is pointing to the tube that goes from the kidney down to the bladder, and that's the ureter. Now we're going to label some of the urinary structures inside of the male pelvis. We'll start on the right-hand side, work our way around the clock. This top line is pointing to a structure that holds urine. It holds it until you're ready to get rid of it, and that is the bladder. So that is pointing to the bladder. The next line is pointing to the urethra. The urethra is the tube that leads from the bladder to the outside. The female urethra is pretty short compared to the male urethra because the male urethra has to go all the way through the penis before it leads to the outside. There are 3 different regions to the male urethra, and this next line is pointing to the first part. The part of the urethra that passes through that gland is called the prostatic urethra because it's passing through the prostate. Females do not have a prostate, males do. So the urethra that goes through the prostate is called the prostatic urethra. The next part of the urethra, the next line, is showing the part of the urethra that goes through the penis. This is called the spongy urethra. Sometimes it's called the penile urethra. There are 2 types of tissues in the penis, and they are erectile tissues, which means they fill with blood and make the penis erect. There is the corpus cavernosum, and then there's the corpus spongiosum, and we'll go over that in the reproductive system. The part of the urethra that goes through the penis goes through the corpus spongiosum, which is why it's called the spongy urethra. All right, the next line is pointing to the urethra that goes through the pelvic floor muscles. That is called the membranous urethra. It's the shortest part of the urethra because it's going through the pelvic floor muscles. So the 3 parts of the urethra, we have the prostatic urethra, we have the membranous urethra, and then there's the spongy urethra, which goes through the penis. The last line is pointing to the tube that goes from the kidney to the bladder, so that is pointing to the ureter. All right, so we have the bladder. First, urine comes down the ureter. We follow the red dot, and then it is stored inside the bladder. The bladder starts filling with urine. As it stretches, it sends the signal to the spinal cord, which sends a reflex back, telling you that you have to pee. So then if you are able to go pee, then the urine passes through the bladder into the urethra. It goes into the prostatic urethra first, then it goes through the membranous urethra of the pelvic floor muscles, and then it goes through the spongy urethra until it leaves through the urethral orifice to the outside. All right, this slide is easy. It's pointing to the structures inside of the body, inside of the torso. The upper left, that is pointing to the kidney. It's pointing to the right kidney. And then the line on the right is pointing to the ureter. And then the last line is pointing to the temporary storage unit for urine, which is the bladder. So kidney, ureter, and bladder. These are the urinary structures inside of the male pelvis again, but the model's a little different, which is why I put it in this PowerPoint. The line that's on the upper left is pointing to the tube that goes from the kidney to the bladder. That is the ureter. All right, continue down on the left. The next line on the left is pointing to the bladder. That's easy enough. And then again, the bottom line is pointing to the spongy urethra. That is the urethra that goes through the penis. Now let's go on the right-hand side. We'll start with the one on the bottom. This is pointing to the urethra that goes to the prostate, so this is the prostatic urethra. And then the last line is pointing to an area inside of the pelvis. It's pointing to this area. I'm going to circle it right there. That's called the trigone, Trigone. The trigone means triangle, and it's a triangle inside of the bladder that's made by 3 openings into or out of the bladder. 2 of the openings are from each ureter, and then 1 opening is from the urethra, and it forms an area called the trigone. No matter how much you try to eliminate all the urine from your bladder, there's still going to be some urine left in the bladder, and it's going to be located at the trigone. All right, this is showing the parts of the male urinary system again. So I don't think I need to use the light too much. This is just showing it by itself. It's not actually in the torso. So if we start on the upper left-hand side, that's pointing to the bladder. All right, nothing new, that's the bladder. And now, going around to the right-hand side, that's the prostatic urethra. That's the part of the urethra going through the prostate. And then the next line is pointing to the membranous urethra. That is the part of the urethra that goes through the pelvic floor muscles. And then the last line is again pointing to the spongy urethra. The spongy urethra starts right here and goes all the way through the penis until it goes out. That's all part of the spongy urethra. And then here we have the female urinary system. We have the same ureter coming down through the pelvis, right here. There's an extra organ inside the female pelvis that males don't have, and is this organ right here, which is the uterus. A lot of people mix up the uterus with the bladder. So the bladder is for the temporary storage of urine. The bladder is right above this, which is going to be the pubic bone. So this blue structure is showing you the fibrocartilage of the pubic symphysis. The bladder is right on top of it, and then here's the uterus on top of the bladder, which is why whenever you're pregnant, as the uterus enlarges with the fetus inside of it, it pushes down and applies pressure to the bladder. Makes you feel like you have to pee all the time from what I hear. All right, let's label some structures. On the right-hand side, this is pointing to the ureter. That's the tube that's going from the kidney all the way to the bladder. Now the next line is pointing to the opening to the outside, which is the external urethral orifice. An orifice is an opening. So that's the external urethral orifice. The internal urethral orifice would actually be right here, wherever the urethra leads to the bladder. All right, the next line is the urethra. The female urethra is a lot shorter than the male urethra, so there's not different sections of it. And then the last line is pointing to the bladder. And that is the urinary system.